The call came over the radio at 9:14 in the morning on day 11 of the search. A volunteer team working the lower drainage had found a man, alive. In the first seconds after the transmission, the search coordinator felt what everyone on those operations feels when that word comes through. Relief, immediate and complete. 11 days, hundreds of searchers, and now a found person. Then the coordinates came through. The coordinator looked at them again, pulled up the map. The location where the volunteer team had found Walter Crisp was 7 miles from his base camp. 7 miles from where he had last been seen. 7 miles from where the search had been concentrated for 11 days. And it was not 7 miles in any direction that made sense. Walter had been found in a drainage on the opposite side of a mountain range from his camp. He had been found at an elevation roughly 2,000 feet lower than anything in the primary search area. He had been found in terrain that required, at minimum, crossing a significant ridgeline and descending a drainage that was not on any route a person would take from Walter's camp to anywhere he had mentioned going. The search coordinator later described the feeling in her incident report. She wrote that her first reaction was that the coordinates were wrong, that the volunteer team had misread their GPS, that something had been transposed. She asked for confirmation. The coordinates were confirmed. Walter Crisp was 7 miles from camp on the wrong side of the mountain, at the bottom of a drainage that connected to nothing in the direction of where he had started. He was alive. He was disoriented and dehydrated and hypothermic. He could not explain how he had gotten there. He still can't. That is where this story begins. Not with the disappearance, with the discovery. Because the discovery is the mystery. The question this case has never answered is the same question the search coordinator asked when those coordinates came through. How did Walter Crisp get there? Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why the discovery was so disorienting, you need to understand what was known about Walter Crisp and what he was doing in those mountains. Walter was 62 years old. He had been hiking and camping in the Wind River Range of Wyoming for 30 years. He went every year, sometimes twice a year. He had covered large sections of the range over 3 decades. He was not a technical alpinist, but he was a capable and experienced backcountry traveler who understood navigation, weather, and the specific risks of that terrain. He carried a compass and a paper topographic map. He was old school about navigation. He didn't trust GPS units as his primary tool, and he told his daughter Lisa, who hiked with him occasionally, that a paper map never runs out of batteries. He was fit for his age. No significant medical history of concern. His last physical examination, 4 months before the disappearance, had found nothing that would predispose him to a sudden medical event. He had planned a 5-day solo trip into the northern Wind Rivers. He had left his truck at a well-documented trailhead, had filed a trip plan with the Sublette County Sheriff's Office, as he typically did, and had entered the wilderness on the morning of August 12th. His trip plan specified 3 intended camp locations. He had hiked to each of those locations before, in prior seasons. He was due out at the trailhead on August 17th. His daughter Lisa drove to the trailhead on August 17th to meet him. His truck was there. Walter was not. Lisa waited at the trailhead for 2 hours. She tried calling his cell phone. No coverage, as expected in that terrain. At 4 in the afternoon, She drove to the nearest point with signal and called the Sublette County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took the call pulled Walter's trip plan on file. 5 days, 3 camp locations, out at the trailhead August 17th. He had not come out. Sublette County search and rescue activated before dark. By the following morning, day 1 of the search, teams were on the trail. The trip plan gave them a framework, 3 camp locations, a stated route. The search began with the assumption that Walter was somewhere along that route, at one of the camps, or between them, or on one of the connecting trails. This assumption was reasonable. It was based on Walter's own written plan. It was wrong, or at least, it was wrong about where Walter ended up. Whether it was wrong about where he started, whether it was wrong about what happened in between, is a question the investigation has not fully resolved. The search in the first week covered Walter's stated route thoroughly. Teams checked the first camp location. Signs of a camp, fire ring, cleared ground, a small pile of rocks that someone had moved, consistent with a camper having been there, not datable to Walter specifically. The second camp location showed no sign of recent use. The third camp location was not reached on the stated route. Teams found the junction where a hiker would turn off the main trail toward the third camp, and they checked the approach. No sign of recent passage. This created the first significant finding of the search. Walter appeared to have reached or passed the first camp location, but there was no evidence he had continued on his stated route to the second and third camps. The search coordinator, Lisa Farlow, adjusted the probability zones. If Walter had left his stated route after the first camp, where might he have gone? The options in that terrain were multiple. The northern wind rivers have a complex topography, lake basins, drainages, ridgelines, multiple passes. A person who left the main trail at the first camp could have gone in several directions. Teams began working the adjacent terrain, the lake basin to the northeast, the drainage to the southwest, the ridgeline above the first camp that connected to a series of high passes. Day 5, nothing. Day 7, nothing. On day 8, the search coordinator requested aerial support. A helicopter began grid flying the primary search area. The helicopter found nothing. On day 9, search dog teams were brought in from out of state. The dogs worked the first camp location and the connecting trails. The dogs tracked a scent trail from the first camp location toward the northeast, toward the lake basin, away from Walter's stated route. The trail was followed for about 2 miles before it degraded in terrain where significant foot traffic from other hikers over the preceding weeks had contaminated the scent environment. The lake basin was searched. Walter was not there. Day 10. Nothing. The search coordinator began preparing for the conversation no coordinator wants to have. The conversation about scaling back an active search. Day 11. The volunteer team in the lower drainage, 7 miles away on the far side of the range, found Walter Crisp. They were not part of the primary search. They were working a separate area. The lower drainage was outside the primary search zone, because a search team leader had made a judgment call 3 days earlier to expand coverage into adjacent terrain that the probability model hadn't prioritized. That judgment call found Walter. But the finding raised more questions than it answered. Let's talk about the location itself, because it is the center of this case, and it needs to be understood in its specificity. The lower drainage where Walter was found runs roughly east to west at an elevation between 8,000 and 8,500 feet. The drainage connects to a trailhead on the eastern boundary of the wilderness area, a different trailhead than the one where Walter had left his truck. From Walter's camp location, the first camp, the last place the search had any evidence of his presence, to where he was found, is, as the crow flies, approximately 5 miles. But as a person walks, the route between those 2 points requires crossing a major ridgeline. The lowest crossing point on that ridgeline is a pass at approximately 10,700 feet elevation. The pass is on no trail Walter had mentioned. It was not in his trip plan. To get from the first camp to the lower drainage where he was found, Walter would have had to leave his stated route, ascend roughly 1,000 feet from the first camp to the pass, cross the pass, descend approximately 2,700 feet into the lower drainage, cover a total ground distance of between 7 and 9 miles, depending on the specific route through the terrain. The terrain at the pass is not technical. An experienced backcountry hiker could cross it. Walter had the experience and the fitness, but the pass was not in his plan. The lower drainage was not in his plan. The eastern trailhead was not in his plan. And when search and rescue personnel reached Walter after the discovery call, he was at a location approximately 3 miles below the pass in the lower drainage, having apparently descended from the pass in the preceding days. He was in poor condition, dehydrated, hypothermic, confused. His food was gone. He had not made a fire, despite having fire-starting equipment in his pack. He had been in that drainage, searchers estimated, for at least 2 to 3 days. 2 to 3 days in a drainage that the primary search had not covered. Walter was transported by helicopter to a hospital. He was treated for dehydration and mild hypothermia. He had no significant injuries, no broken bones, no head trauma, nothing that indicated a fall or a physical event. The treating physician noted that Walter was confused and disoriented on admission, but that this was consistent with his physical condition, extended time without adequate food and water, exposure, and the physiological effects of several days of difficult terrain. The physician was asked, specifically, whether Walter's disorientation could be attributed to a neurological event, a stroke, a seizure, a period of unconsciousness that might explain disorientation in the backcountry. The physician said he could not rule that out, but that nothing in the presentation or the subsequent evaluation specifically indicated a neurological event. Walter's neurological exam on admission was abnormal in ways consistent with dehydration and exhaustion, not in ways specific to stroke or seizure. The question was not definitively answered. Investigators interviewed Walter over 3 sessions in the 2 weeks after his discharge. His account of the days between August 12th and his discovery on August 22nd was fragmentary and inconsistent in specific ways that deserve attention. He remembered the first day's hike clearly. He remembered reaching the first camp location, making camp, cooking dinner, going to sleep. He remembered waking up the following morning. After that, his account became unclear in a way that was not simply a matter of poor memory. It was, investigators noted, as if specific segments of time were missing. Not hazy, not uncertain. Missing. He could describe specific moments, sitting near water, moving through terrain, looking at his compass, but he could not connect those moments into a coherent sequence. He did not know, when he tried to reconstruct his movements, what order things had happened in. He knew he had crossed a ridgeline. He could describe the general appearance of high terrain with a broad view to the east. He could not say when he had crossed it or what had led him to cross it. He knew he had descended into a drainage. He could describe moving downhill for a long time, following water. He did not know why he had gone that way. There were two items in Walter's pack that investigators noted as significant. The first was his topographic map. Walter had said before the trip that he always carried his map and always consulted it when making route decisions. He was meticulous about this. Lisa confirmed it. She said her father had a habit of marking his daily position on the map each morning before he broke camp. When the map was recovered and examined, it had markings through the first camp location. The daily position marks were in pencil, small and precise, exactly as Lisa described. There were no marks beyond the first camp. Either Walter had stopped marking his position after the first camp, which would be contrary to his stated habit and practice, or he had lost the map, and this was a copy or a different section. It was not a different section. It was the same map he had started with. Investigators confirmed this from the trip planning documentation he had left with his daughter. Walter had stopped marking his map after the first camp. He had no explanation for why. The second item was his compass. Walter's compass, when recovered, was functional. It was the same model he had used for years. But the investigators who handled it noticed something. The compass lanyard, the cord by which it was typically worn or attached to gear, was broken. Not worn through. Not frayed at a stress point. Cut. The lanyard had been cut cleanly. Not with a knife, the examiner thought, more like with a sharp rock edge. But cleanly enough that the break was deliberate rather than accidental. Investigators asked Walter about it. He said he didn't remember cutting it. He said he didn't know how it had happened. The compass itself worked. The lanyard had been replaced by a piece of paracord from Walter's pack, tied in a basic knot. At some point in the days he couldn't account for, Walter had cut his compass lanyard and replaced it with paracord. He did not know when or why. Now let's address the central problem directly. The rote problem. Walter was found at approximately mile marker 7 of the lower drainage, measured from the pass. He had presumably descended from the pass to reach that location. The pass, as noted, is at 10,700 feet. The location where he was found is at approximately 8,300 feet, 2,400 feet of descent over roughly 7 miles of drainage terrain. That descent is possible. For an experienced backcountry hiker in reasonable condition, it's a full day of travel, but achievable. The ascent to the pass from the first camp is approximately 1,000 feet over about 2 miles of terrain. For someone of Walter's experience and fitness, a manageable morning's climb. So the physical journey is possible. That's not the question. The question is navigational. Why would Walter leave his stated route, climb a pass that was not in his plan, and descend into a drainage that connected to nothing he had mentioned? Investigators considered the possibility that Walter had deliberately changed his plan, decided, while in the field, to extend his trip into new terrain. He was the kind of experienced hiker who occasionally did this. Lisa confirmed that her father had, in prior years, occasionally varied from his filed trip plan when the terrain offered something interesting. But he had never gone this far off plan. and he had never failed to communicate a change when he reached a point where he could. The eastern trailhead, the one connected to the lower drainage, was approximately 3 miles below where Walter was found. If he had been mobile and oriented, he could have walked out of the wilderness through that trailhead days earlier. He had not. He had been in the lower drainage for 2 to 3 days, according to the medical estimate, and had not moved toward the trailhead. A person who is lost typically moves toward lower terrain, toward water, toward signs of human presence. These are the behavioral heuristics that wilderness survival training teaches, and they are also what most disoriented people do instinctively. The lower drainage was lower terrain. It had water. It ran toward the trailhead. Walter had followed the drainage down from the pass to approximately 7 miles above the trailhead. And then he had stopped. He had been within 3 miles of a trailhead for 2 to 3 days and had not continued toward it. Investigators asked him why. He said he didn't know he was near a trailhead. He said he didn't know where he was. Let's bring in the witness accounts, because the Wind Rivers in August are not uninhabited. Other hikers were in the area during the days of Walter's disappearance, and investigators collected statements from several of them. The most significant came from a group of 3 backpackers who had crossed the pass, the same pass Walter apparently crossed, on August 14th, 2 days after Walter entered the wilderness. They had been heading from east to west, in the opposite direction from Walter's presumed travel. On the east side of the pass, descending toward the lower drainage, they had passed a man traveling alone, going the other direction, up toward the pass. They described him as older, fit, moving slowly but steadily. He was carrying a full pack. He nodded at them as they passed. No conversation. When investigators showed them a photograph of Walter Crisp, 2 of the 3 said yes. One said, probably. No one said, no. A solo man, matching Walter's description, ascending the pass on August 14th. 2 days after Walter had last been in a known location. This was significant. It placed Walter, if the identification was correct, at the pass on August 14th, traveling west to east. He was going up, toward the pass, not down into the drainage. Wait. That means he was approaching the pass from the wilderness side, heading east, heading toward the lower drainage. The timeline from that point. August 14th at the pass. Found August 22nd, 7 miles down the drainage from the pass. 8 days. 8 days to cover 7 miles of drainage terrain that an unimpaired hiker could cover in a day. What happened in those 8 days? The medical team estimated he had been in the lower section of the drainage, near where he was found, for 2 to 3 days. That accounted for roughly the last portion of the time window. The remaining 5 days are unaccounted for. 5 days between the pass and the lower drainage. 5 days in terrain that, at a normal pace, should have taken 1. The second witness account came from a solo hiker named Rebecca Chow, who had been camped in the upper portion of the lower drainage on the nights of August 16th and 17th. Rebecca described hearing what she thought was another person moving through the brush near her camp on the night of August 16th. She had a headlamp and went to look. She saw no one. She attributed the noise to a bear or a deer and went back to sleep. On the morning of August 17th, she found footprints in a soft section of soil near her campsite. Human footprints, moving in the direction of her camp from uphill, and then turning and moving away. She hadn't thought much of it. Other hikers in the drainage was not unusual. She had moved on. She reported this when she saw the notice about the search. The footprints were in a location approximately 4.5 miles above where Walter was eventually found. If those prints were Walter's, it meant he had been in the upper section of the drainage on August 16th or in the pre-dawn hours of August 17th. And then he had traveled 4.5 miles downhill over the following 5 days. 4.5 miles. 5 days. Less than a mile a day. A man of Walter's experience and fitness, moving less than a mile a day in a drainage that ran downhill. Something was happening in those 5 days that the evidence doesn't explain. Was he injured? The medical evaluation found no injuries. Was he confused? His account suggested fragmented memory for that period. Was he stopping and starting, making camps and moving on, for reasons he couldn't later articulate? The evidence doesn't say. Day 3 of the search had produced a finding that the coordinator had filed, and then, as the search expanded, hadn't returned to as prominently as it perhaps warranted. On Day 3, a search team working the lake basin northeast of the first camp had found a piece of gear. A stuff sack, the small nylon bag used to pack and compress sleeping bags and insulation layers. Orange, generic design. The stuff sack was to the edge of the lake basin, near a rocky area above the lake itself. The team photographed it and collected it. They noted it as potentially significant. It could belong to the missing person. When the item was later examined and compared against the gear list Walter had filed with his trip plan, it did not match any item on the list. Lisa was shown the stuff sack and said she didn't recognize it as her father's. The stuff sack was logged as unrelated and set aside. But the location where it was found, the lake basin northeast of the first camp, was the area where the dogs had tracked the scent before losing it on Day 9. Dogs went northeast. A piece of gear was in the northeast basin. But the gear wasn't Walter's, or wasn't confirmed as Walter's. The connection was noted in the cold case review, 3 years after Walter's disappearance, by a reviewer who went back through the full case file. The reviewer wrote that the stuff sack could not be confirmed as Walter's, but that its presence at the northeast basin, in the same area the dogs had tracked, should be noted. He also wrote that the northeast basin was one of the terrain features with a possible route connection to the pass, not the most direct route, but a possible one. A route that would take a person from the first camp, northeast through the lake basin, and then up a high ridge that connected, via a traverse, to the east side of the pass. If Walter had gone northeast to the lake basin and then traversed to the pass, rather than taking the more direct southern route to the pass, the total distance and terrain would be significantly more complex. It would help explain why he was moving slowly. It would help explain the fragmented timeline. It would not explain why he went that way instead of a simpler route. It would not explain why he couldn't remember it. Let's examine the theories investigators formally considered. The first is the most medically grounded, a neurological event, a TIA, sometimes called a mini-stroke or a seizure, that caused a period of altered consciousness and subsequent memory gaps. This is a documented phenomenon in wilderness medicine. A person who has a neurological event in the backcountry can continue moving, can make decisions that appear purposeful, and can have fragmentary or absent memory of the event period. The behavioral profile can look, from the outside, like disorientation or wandering. Walter's medical evaluation on admission did not specifically confirm or rule out a prior neurological event. A TIA in particular often leaves no diagnostic marker days later. The fragmented sequential memory gaps that Walter described, not hazy recollections, but specific absences, are consistent with the aftermath of a neurological event. The medical theory is the one that most of the investigators who worked the case consider most likely. But it doesn't answer all the questions. A TIA or seizure could explain the memory gaps. It could explain the disorientation. It could explain why Walter moved away from his stated route and into terrain he hadn't planned. It doesn't fully explain 7 miles of movement across a major ridgeline. A person in a significantly altered neurological state does not typically execute a sustained multi-day traverse through complex terrain. They tend to stop. The medical theory has explanatory value. It also has limits. The second theory is cumulative disorientation, not a single event, but a progressive loss of navigational orientation over multiple days as fatigue, inadequate food and water intake, and decision fatigue compounded. Walter had packed 5 days of food. He was found on day 11. He had been in the field for 10 days. His food was gone. A person in extended caloric deficit, in cold conditions, with inadequate sleep, their cognitive function degrades in documented and predictable ways. Decision-making becomes impaired. Spatial reasoning, which navigation depends on, is particularly vulnerable to exhaustion. Under this theory, Walter left his stated route at some point after the first camp, possibly after an initial navigational error that he couldn't correct, and progressively moved into terrain that was increasingly unfamiliar, making decisions that made sense in the moment, but contributed to moving him further from where he should have been. The cut compass lanyard, cut and replaced with paracord, might reflect a decision made during a period of impaired judgment. Why cut a functioning lanyard and replace it with paracord? Under normal circumstances, you wouldn't. Under impaired judgment, the behavior might have made sense at the time in a way that wasn't recoverable in retrospect. The cumulative disorientation theory has the advantage of not requiring a single dramatic event. It describes a gradual process. Its limitation is the same as the medical theories. 7 miles across a major ridgeline is a significant, sustained navigational action. Even impaired, Walter managed to cross terrain that required ascending 1,000 feet to a pass. That's not random wandering. That's purposeful, if misdirected, movement. The third theory is the most speculative and the least satisfying. Walter went to the pass intentionally, for a reason he cannot now articulate and may not have had a rational explanation for at the time. This could be a component of either the medical or the cumulative disorientation theory. A person in an altered state, acting on impulses or perceptions that felt compelling in the moment. But some investigators who reviewed the case noted that Walter's movement, while disoriented in outcome, showed a kind of internal logic. He followed water. He moved downhill. He didn't thrash through dense timber or climb steep walls without apparent purpose. His path, reconstructed from the witness accounts and the boot print evidence, was consistent with someone who was navigating, who was reading the terrain, even if he was doing so incorrectly in terms of where he needed to go. A person who is truly confused doesn't navigate efficiently in the wrong direction. They typically don't navigate efficiently in any direction. Walter covered a lot of ground. He just covered it in a direction that didn't lead to where he needed to be. What was he following? What was he moving toward? He doesn't know. The two comparative cases are worth examining, not because they provide answers, but because they establish that the pattern, a person found at a significant, unexpected distance from where they disappeared, is not unique. The first involves a hiker named Sandra Frey, 59 years old, who disappeared from the Sierras of California in June of 2008 and was found 12 days later, alive, approximately 9 miles from her last known location. Like Walter, she was in poor condition. Like Walter, she had fragmentary and inconsistent memories of the period of her disappearance. The route she would have had to travel to reach her discovery location required crossing a ridgeline that was not in her planned route. Like Walter's case, the physical journey was possible, but navigationally inexplicable, given what investigators knew of her plan and her stated experience level. Sandra Frey's medical evaluation on discovery was also inconclusive regarding a neurological event. She recovered fully and continues to have no explanation for how she ended up where she was found. Her case remains open in the sense that no explanation has ever been formally established. The second case involves a hiker named Thomas Vestal, 67 years old, who disappeared from a trail system in the Cascades of Washington State in October of 2015. He was found 8 days later, alive, approximately 11 miles from the trailhead where he had started. The 11 miles would not, by themselves, be remarkable. 11 miles of hiking is a reasonable day's travel. The remarkable feature was the terrain between Thomas's starting point and his discovery location. It included 2 ridge crossings. The second ridge crossing, the one he would have had to make to reach the drainage where he was found, was at a pass that was not on any established trail and that most hikers would have found difficult to identify as a route. Thomas Vestal had no explanation for why he had gone that way. His memory of the 8 days was, like Walter Crisp's, fragmented in a way that investigators described as unusual, not the normal uncertainty of someone trying to recall a stressful period. Specific gaps. He recovered fully. He has never been able to fill in those gaps. David Polides, in his documentation of wilderness disappearance cases, has specifically noted the category of found alive cases in which the subject is located at an unexpected distance, in terrain inconsistent with their stated plan, with fragmentary memory of the period. He has documented multiple such cases across decades and across different terrain types. His documentation does not explain the pattern, but the documentation itself, the number of cases, the consistency of the specific features, suggests the pattern is real and not simply the result of chance variations in individual incidents. Walter Crisp gave a final interview to a journalist from a regional outdoor publication 2 years after his recovery. He had, by then, been evaluated neurologically on 3 separate occasions. No specific diagnosis had been established. He said the experience had changed how he understood his own capabilities. Not in the way you might expect. He wasn't saying he no longer trusted himself in the backcountry. He said he trusted himself less in a specific way. He no longer trusted that his memory of being in the backcountry was necessarily a reliable record of what had actually happened. He said, "I've been in those mountains for 30 years. I've always known where I was, I've always known what I was doing and why. And then there was a period of time, more than a week, where I apparently moved through those mountains, crossed a ridgeline, descended a drainage, and I don't have a coherent account of any of it. That's not something I can fully explain or fully accept. He said the worst part was not the physical ordeal. The worst part was the gap. He said, I look at a map of the area and I trace the route from my camp to where they found me, and I know that I must have done that. The evidence says I did, but I don't have a memory of doing it that I can trust, and that's a strange thing to live with. He was asked whether he had any theory about what had happened to him. He said he had many theories, and none of them was satisfying. He said the closest he had come to an explanation was the acknowledgement that something had happened to him, medically, cognitively, something that had taken him out of his normal functioning for a period of time, and that during that period he had moved in ways that were purposeful enough to cover significant ground, but not purposeful enough to bring him home. He said, whatever was driving my decisions during that time, it wasn't a part of me that knows how to get home. The Sublette County Sheriff's case file on Walter Crisp was eventually closed as a resolved missing persons case, because Walter was found. The investigation into what had happened to him was not a separate criminal proceeding, and there was no obvious crime to investigate. But the questions the case raised were not resolved simply because Walter was found. The cold case review, initiated at the family's request 3 years after the incident, produced a summary that acknowledged 7 specific unresolved questions. Among them, what caused Walter to leave his stated route after the first camp? What was his route from the first camp to the pass? Did he go directly or through the lake basin? What happened in the 5 days between the backpackers seeing him at the pass on August 14th and the footprints near Rebecca Chow's camp on August 16th? Why did he stop within 3 miles of the eastern trailhead for 2 to 3 days without continuing? What was the cause of his memory gaps during the period in question? And the question that the case is best known for, the one that every person who has studied the file returns to. How did Walter Crisp travel 7 miles across a ridgeline he hadn't mentioned, into a drainage he hadn't planned, and emerge on the other side with no coherent account of how he got there? The cold case reviewer's final paragraph is worth quoting in full. He wrote, "The subject's physical recovery was complete and is not in question. The circumstances that produced his displacement from his stated route remain unexplained. The medical evaluations conducted since his recovery have not established a definitive diagnosis that accounts for the specific features of this case. The case is formally resolved in the sense that the subject was found alive. It is not resolved in the investigative sense. The question of how Walter Crisp traveled from his first camp to the lower drainage, crossing a ridgeline that was not in his plan, over a period of time that is only partially accounted for by witness testimony, remains open. Formally resolved. Investigatively open. That distinction is the honest place where this case lives. Walter Crisp was found. The question of how he got where he was found has not been answered. The wind rivers are still there. The pass at 10,700 feet is still there. The lower drainage, running east toward the trailhead, still runs. Every summer, hikers and backpackers enter that wilderness through the same trailhead where Walter left his truck. They file trip plans, or they don't. They carry maps, or they carry GPS units. They plan routes, and then sometimes deviate from them. Most of them come out where they planned. Some of them don't. Walter Crisp is in the category that came out. Alive, recovered, functional. He counts as a success in the search and rescue ledger. But he is also in a smaller category. The category of people who were found somewhere that the available evidence cannot explain. Who traveled a distance and crossed terrain that the investigations of smart, careful, experienced people have not been able to reconstruct. Lisa Crisp, Walter's daughter, who waited at the trailhead on August 17th and started the call that initiated 11 days of searching, said something in a conversation with the journalist who covered her father's case that has stayed with the people who worked the investigation. She said, "They found my father. I'm grateful for that. I'll always be grateful for that. But they found him 7 miles from where he should have been, on the wrong side of a mountain, with no memory of how he got there." She said, "That's not the same as understanding what happened." She's right. Walter Crisp was found. The answer to how he got there wasn't found with him, and it hasn't been found since. How does an experienced backcountry traveler with a compass and a map and 30 years in the mountains end up 7 miles from camp, on the wrong side of a ridgeline, with no coherent memory of the journey? That question is the one this case leaves behind. It has not been answered. It is still worth asking.